Hey guys, tonight we set out together on one of the longest, dustiest, and let's be honest, most blisters per foot journeys of the Middle Ages, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Picture yourself in the year 1280, lacing up sandals that have already seen better days, hoisting a bag barely big enough for bread and a blanket, and stepping out onto a road that stretches farther than you want to imagine. The morning air is crisp, there's dew still clinging to the grass, and you're standing in line with dozens of others who are about to walk across half of Europe just to visit one very famous set of bones. You probably won't survive this trip if you're wearing flip-flops, by the way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing those time zones stack up. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval pilgrimage begins not with a trumpet fanfare, but with the clumsy sound of sandals scraping against cobblestones. You step out of your village, leaving behind whatever goats, gardens, or gossipy neighbors normally fill your days. There's no turning back now. Well, actually, people did sometimes turn back after the first day, realizing this was a terrible idea, but tonight you're more committed. Ahead of you lies the famous road west toward Galicia, where the shrine of St. James supposedly waits with open arms, or at least with a very elaborate reliquary. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, of bread baking in a communal oven, and of wet earth. Children call out goodbyes, wishing you luck or laughing at your oversized walking stick. Pilgrims often carried these stout staffs, sometimes taller than themselves, meant equally for support and for swatting away suspicious dogs. The staff, the little pouch, and eventually that seashell badge you'll pick up, these are the hallmarks of a pilgrim. Without them, you're just some random traveler who took a wrong turn. Already you feel a mix of nerves and excitement. What awaits you? Pilgrims' tales from the taverns promised everything from divine visions to free bread along the way, though the bread was often moldy and the visions probably the result of dehydration. Still, you set one foot in front of the other, feeling the rhythm settle into your bones. Step, staff, breath, step, staff, breath. It's hypnotic, like the medieval version of white noise. The first villages you pass through are small but curious about you. Local peasants glance up from their plows and mutter blessings, or sometimes grumble about another mouth to feed if you decide to beg for food. Hospitality toward pilgrims was a religious duty, yes, but also a strain on rural resources. Some farmers gave willingly, others gave a loaf so stale it could double as a weapon. You accept what you're offered with the polite smile of someone who has no choice. Mainstream historians agree that the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, was one of the three great pilgrimages of medieval Christendom alongside Rome and Jerusalem. But what set Compostela apart was its accessibility. You didn't need a ship, and you didn't need to risk Ottoman-controlled roads. You just needed legs, patience, and a very forgiving pair of shoes. Some scholars still argue whether the cult of St. James was more a spiritual movement or a clever invention by Spanish kings eager to put their kingdom on the holy map. But for the average person like you, it hardly mattered. What mattered was the hope, forgiveness of sins, healing of ailments, or maybe just bragging rights when you stumbled home months later with a shell pinned to your cloak. The early days of walking are oddly pleasant. Spring air keeps you cool, the fields are green, and your fellow pilgrims are still chatty. You hear stories of faraway lands, arguments about theology, and at least one off-key lute performance. Everyone is still fresh enough to joke, trading little barbs about who snores the loudest or who packs too much garlic. Humor is essential because nothing bonds a group of strangers faster than sore feet and the realization you all smell equally terrible after 3 days without a bath. One quirky detail: some pilgrims would deliberately start barefoot, believing the pain and blisters were part of their penance. Others tied tiny bells to their cloaks so people could hear them coming, useful both as a sign of devotion and as an early warning system for innkeepers. You mercifully have sandals, though one strap already looks suspiciously frayed. At night you curl up under the stars, cloak pulled tight against the chill. The sky is wider than anything you've ever seen back home. It stretches endlessly, dotted with more stars than your sleepy brain can count. Somewhere up there is the Milky Way, which people in the Middle Ages actually called the Camino de Santiago too, believing it pointed directly to the saint's resting place. That's right. The galaxy itself was considered a kind of cosmic road sign. Not the worst GPS system, though definitely less reliable on cloudy nights. By the second or third morning, the novelty wears off. Your shoulders ache from carrying even the lightest bag, your sandals are beginning to gnaw at your heels, and you've already learned that medieval roads are not exactly smooth. Stones jab your feet, muddy puddles cling to your legs, and every donkey cart passing by seems determined to splash you. Still, you keep moving, because what else is there? As the sun climbs higher, you begin to smell yourself, which is always a sobering moment. Pilgrims didn't exactly travel with a toiletry kit unless you count a single rag that did double duty as towel and napkin. Medieval guides recommended keeping clean as the body allows, which is basically a polite way of saying, don't worry, everyone stinks. You comfort yourself knowing the saint himself probably wouldn't judge. That first stretch of walking sets the rhythm for the entire journey. It's less about reaching the shrine and more about enduring each step. Your staff taps your sandals scuff and your thoughts wander. You hum an old hymn count, the clouds imagine roasted chicken, and then laugh quietly at yourself. You're barely a week in and already dreaming of food. At least tonight's dinner might include a hunk of cheese if you can trade for it. By evening, you finally spot the outline of a small chapel, its bell calling pilgrims to rest and prayer. The building isn't grand, more like a lopsided stone hut, but to your tired body, it looks like a palace. You step inside, drop your bag, and breathe in the faint smell of incense. Other pilgrims are already snoring, their sandals lined up at the door, like sleepy little soldiers. You join them, grateful for a roof, even if the straw mattress crackles suspiciously with lice. And so your first true day on the road comes to a close. Your feet are blistered, your cloak is dusty, and you're already questioning life choices. But tomorrow you'll rise again and walk farther west because the promise of Santiago and that strange little seashell waiting at the end pulls you forward like gravity. The second morning begins with that telltale medieval alarm clock, somebody's donkey braying outside, followed by a cough that sounds like it's been echoing since the Black Death. You roll off your straw mattress scratch at a suspicious bite and pull your sandals back on. The road doesn't wait. It stretches ahead, dusty and endless, like a ribbon laid across the landscape just to test your patience. Step by step, you fall back into the rhythm staff, tapping sandals, scraping. At first, the road feels friendly. Wildflowers nod lazily in the breeze, and the smell of damp earth still lingers from last night's dew. But soon the sun rises higher, pressing down with that heavy Spanish warmth. Dust clings to your calves, turning them into two walking loaves of bread. You sneeze. You cough. You wonder if pilgrims were supposed to glow with holiness, because right now, you just look like a very tired chimney sweep. The long roads of the Camino were famous for their monotony. You'd walk through miles of wheat fields, then vineyards, then more wheat fields. To keep spirits up, pilgrims sang hymns, muttered prayers, or in your case, started counting how many rocks you could kick without stubbing a toe. Historians still argue whether the Camino was deliberately laid out to pass through significant spiritual landscapes, or whether it simply followed the most practical trade routes west. Either way, to your blistered feet, it doesn't matter, the road is just long. Around midday, you encounter your first proper hill. It rises like a smug giant in front of you, and the road coils up its side like a taunt. Step breath, you climb slowly, sweating through your cloak. By the time you reach the top, your legs feel like porridge, but the view is staggering. Valleys open below, dotted with villages, streams glinting in the sun. For a moment, you forget the ache. You feel small, but also strangely important, just one of thousands of pilgrims who have seen this same view over the centuries. At the top, you pause to share bread with a fellow traveler. His name doesn't matter, you'll forget it in 3 days, but he's from a village you've never heard of, and he has the same goal to reach Santiago. That's one of the oddest parts of this road. People from across Europe, English, French, German, Italian, shuffle along together, mumbling prayers in languages you don't understand. Yet somehow you all belong here, your footsteps echoing the same hope. Mainstream historical fact, many of these roads doubled as vital trade routes. Pilgrims didn't just walk in isolation, they shared paths with merchants leading mules loaded with wine or salt, with farmers herding geese and occasionally with soldiers moving from one frontier to another. This meant the Camino was never a silent, lonely trail. It was noisy, busy, and sometimes smelled strongly of garlic. One quirky tidbit there were medieval travel guides, handwritten books that advised pilgrims on what to expect. These Codex Calixtinus-type manuscripts warned of thieves, recommended inns, and even listed which local wines were worth trying. Yes, medieval Yelp existed, though sadly no star ratings. You wish you'd brought a copy, but instead you rely on the chatter of fellow pilgrims who may or may not know what they're talking about. The hours drag on. Afternoon heat sets in and the road offers little shade. You tie a rag around your head pretending it's a hat, though really it just makes you look like a very confused bandit. You imagine fountains of cold water, roasted chickens, and maybe even a nap in a hammock. Instead, you get warm water from a wooden flask and the sight of yet another hill. To keep your mind occupied, you listen to stories. A French pilgrim nearby claims he saw a miracle last year, a dying man healed after touching the shrine. Another swears he heard singing angels along the road, though judging by his wine breath, it might have been local shepherds after too much ale. Historians still debate how much of this miracle lore was sincere faith and how much was clever tourism marketing by monasteries eager to draw visitors. But as the hours pass, you admit the stories help keep you moving. Late in the day, you stumble into a grove where other pilgrims are resting. Someone has started a small fire roasting onions on sticks. The smell is heavenly, or at least better than your sweaty cloak. You chew a hunk of bread, dunk it into a bit of oil offered by a stranger, and suddenly dinner feels like a feast. That's the thing about long walks. Hunger makes every scrap taste miraculous. As twilight falls, you hear bells in the distance. A small village looms ahead, its stone houses clustered tightly, a little church at the center. Chickens scatter as you and your fellow pilgrims shuffle in your arrival, both a blessing and a nuisance for the locals. The villagers know you're bringing prayers and coins, but also dust lice and endless requests for food. You can't blame them for giving you side-eye. Tonight, you sleep in a barn squeezed between straw bales and the occasional cow. The cows, frankly, are better company than the snoring pilgrim beside you. As you settle in, you notice the rafters above lined with spider webs glowing faintly in the moonlight. It feels oddly peaceful, like the road itself is wrapping you in its patient, dusty embrace. And so the long, dusty roads stretch on, endless, weary, but strangely comforting. Tomorrow there will be more walking, more dust, and more blisters. But tonight you close your eyes, letting the hum of distant crickets lull you into a sleep that feels almost holy. The sun is barely awake when the smell of smoke and bread pulls you back into consciousness. You shift on your straw bedding, scratch at a few more itchy bites, and stretch limbs that feel like they've been borrowed from an old mule. Today's path calls, and with it the curiosity of what you'll eat, or more accurately, what you'll endure in the name of dinner. As you shoulder your bag and fall in step with fellow travelers, the question of food is already buzzing in the air. Pilgrims in the Middle Ages had no fancy meal plans, no carefully packed snacks, and definitely no protein bars. What you ate depended entirely on what villagers or monasteries were willing or able to share. Most days the menu was as repetitive as it was uninspired: bread, cheese, maybe a thin soup if fortune smiled on you. By mid-morning, your stomach begins to growl like an unhappy watchdog. Someone passes you a hunk of yesterday's bread. It's so hard you could probably use it as a building material. You gnaw at it anyway because hunger has a way of turning even rock-solid bread into a delicacy. You imagine dipping it into something: olive oil, honey, anything moist, but your imagination will have to do. The diet of pilgrims was notoriously bland. Bread was the backbone of every meal, often accompanied by thin vegetable broths or pottages. If you were lucky, you might find beans or lentils swimming in the pot, though calling them swimming is generous. They were usually drowning in water. Meat was rare and prized, often reserved for feast days or those who had deeper purses. You'll mostly survive on carbs, which explains why your dreams tonight may involve an endless table of roasted chickens laughing at you. Historians tell us that monasteries along the Camino offered food and shelter as acts of charity. Hospitality was a religious duty, and feeding a pilgrim was thought to earn spiritual credit. But let's be honest, the monks didn't hand out lavish spreads. You were more likely to receive half a ladle of cabbage soup and a sermon about humility than anything resembling a banquet. And if you complained, well, that just proved you needed more humility. One quirky fact, some pilgrims carried little knives and wooden spoons because utensils were not always provided. Bread, however, doubled as both plate and utensil. You'd scoop soup with it, soak it until it turned mushy, and then eat the evidence. The scallop shell, the very one that would later become the emblem of Santiago, was sometimes used as a bowl or a makeshift spoon. Imagine slurping thin soup from a seashell. It sounds poetic, but mostly it was just messy. Around midday, you stumble across a group of locals selling wine from a wooden cask. It's sour, rough on the throat, but also safer than drinking most water. Pilgrims often relied on wine or ale because rivers and wells were not exactly clean, especially after cows had wandered through. You take a sip, feel the sharpness on your tongue, and pretend you're dining like a lord, though the truth is, you're just tipsy enough to forget how much your feet hurt. Scholars still argue whether the Camino diet was adequate to sustain such long journeys. Some point to the sheer number of pilgrims who reached Compostela as proof it worked. Others note the malnourishment and illnesses recorded in chronicles. Perhaps the real secret was stubbornness. You kept walking even if all you had in your belly was half a crust and a prayer. As evening approaches, you arrive at a roadside inn, or what passes for one. A smoky room, a dirt floor, benches that creak with every shift. A steaming pot hangs over the fire, its contents looking suspiciously like cabbage that gave up on life several days ago. You sit waiting for your turn, your stomach begging you not to ask too many questions about what's floating in the broth. When the bowl is finally handed over, you eat it all, grateful for the warmth more than the taste. The inn is crowded, buzzing with tired voices. Someone strums a lute badly in the corner, trying to distract everyone from the fact that the bread smells faintly of mildew. A group of German pilgrims laugh as they compare the soup to dishwater, while a Spaniard insists it's good for the soul. You chew slowly, pretending you're savoring it when really you're calculating whether to ask for seconds. Later that night, lying on the floor among strangers, your mind drifts back to food. Did people ever dream of endless feasts just to keep walking, maybe? Or maybe the act of eating together, no matter how poor the meal, made the Camino feel less lonely. Your stomach is still grumbling, but your heart feels full, at least until tomorrow's bread threatens to chip another tooth. The morning breaks not with a rooster's crow, but with the tuneless humming of a man who clearly believes he's destined for the cathedral choir. You sigh, roll up your cloak, and shuffle outside where the road is already gathering its motley crew. Today you notice the company more than the dust. The Camino isn't just about saints and shrines, it's about the odd parade of people you end up walking beside. Some are perfectly ordinary farmers, widows, apprentices sent by their masters, but others are the kind of characters you'd expect in a traveling play. There's a wiry fellow with a lute slung over his back who strums the same 3 notes all morning. He swears he's writing a ballad about the Camino, but judging by his progress, you suspect it'll have only 1 verse. Then there's a woman from Brittany with a dog that looks half wolf, half mop. The animal trots loyally at her heels, pausing now and then to eye your bread with far too much interest. Travel companions on the Camino were never predictable. Some pilgrims genuinely sought holiness. Others used the road as cover to escape debt scandals or simply boredom at home. Historians still argue whether medieval society encouraged the pilgrimage out of devotion, or whether it was a convenient way to get restless troublemakers out of town for a few months. Whatever the case, the road is alive with personalities, and you find yourself half walking, half eavesdropping. One man boasts that he's walked all the way from Cologne, though his shoes look suspiciously new. Another swears he's seen visions of St. James himself, but conveniently only when no one else was around. And then there are the pickpockets. Yes, even among pilgrims, not everyone played fair. The medieval guidebooks warned about thieves in pilgrim garb who mingled in the crowd, waiting for you to fall asleep before snatching your pouch. You clutch your bag a little tighter, trying to look humble but not gullible. Quirky detail entertainers often tagged along. Jugglers, singers, even men with trained animals turned the Camino into a moving festival. Imagine trudging uphill, legs aching, when suddenly a man with a monkey on a leash strolls past. Not exactly holy, but definitely distracting. The church sometimes frowned on these companions, but in truth they made the road bearable. At midday you stop in a small square where a group of pilgrims swap stories. Someone pulls out dice, rolling them on the flat surface of a barrel. Gambling was technically frowned upon, but that never stopped anyone. You throw the dice, once lose immediately, and decide God is probably sending you a message to stick to prayer. Mealtime brings its own oddities. A pair of Italian pilgrims insist on cooking pasta from scratch in a battered pot they carry everywhere. The noodles come out uneven, lumpy, but astonishingly delicious compared to yesterday's stale bread. You share a bowl grateful, while the lute player tries to serenade everyone into donating another onion for his supper. As evening approaches, a rainstorm sweeps in. You huddle under a tree with a dozen strangers, water dripping from your cloak, your sandals squelching. Nobody complains. Instead, someone begins telling a story, an old folk tale about wolves in the forest. You listen half smiling because this is how medieval evenings worked. No Netflix, no radio, just tired people spinning tales while trying to stay dry. By nightfall, the group sprawls in a barn offered by a sympathetic farmer. It smells strongly of hay and livestock, but you hardly care. Pilgrims are lined shoulder to shoulder, boots and bags piled in corners. Someone's dog snores louder than its owner. Someone else sings a lullaby in French, off-key but soothing. You realize, drifting off, that the Camino is less a solitary path and more a moving village. The companions may be odd musicians, gamblers, thieves, and saints all crammed together, but they're the glue that keeps the long road from breaking your spirit. You fall asleep to the gentle chorus of snores, wheezes, and the faint squeak of that lute string breaking once again. You wake to the sound of bells, soft, metallic, and strangely reassuring. At first, you assume they belong to sheep or cattle, but soon you realize they're church bells from a nearby chapel calling not just locals but weary pilgrims like you. They remind you that this isn't just a very long hiking trip. This is a march with a holy destination, and at its center lies the cult of St. James. As you set out again, the road narrows between hedges, then widens into farmland, the smell of tilled soil hanging heavy in the morning air. Someone nearby begins explaining, perhaps for the 50th time, who exactly St. James was. You already know the basics: one of the 12 apostles, brother of John, a fisherman turned disciple. But here's the twist. While James supposedly preached in Spain, most historians today quietly raise their eyebrows at that claim. Did he really reach Iberia? Or was this a medieval invention to make Spain's shrines rival Rome? And Jerusalem scholars still argue, their debates echoing like the tapping of staffs along the Camino. According to legend, after James was martyred in Jerusalem, his body was miraculously transported by sea to the coast of Galicia. Depending on which version you hear, the boat was guided by angels, or maybe it was made of stone that floated like wood. Either way, the saint's remains arrived, were buried, forgotten for centuries, and then dramatically rediscovered in the 9th century by a shepherd following a mysterious star. Compostela, literally field of stars, was born from that moment. You glance upward, wondering whether tonight the heavens will point you onward too. By the 11th and 12th centuries, this cult of St. James had become powerful. Kings and bishops promoted it, turning Santiago into a rallying point during the Christian reconquest of Iberia. Pilgrims flocked here not only for spiritual salvation, but also as a statement of solidarity. Walking west was more than piety, it was politics wrapped in prayer. The kings gained prestige, the towns gained wealth, and you, trudging through mud, gained blisters. Everyone won something in their own way. Mid-morning, your group reaches a crossroads where a stone marker stands. Carved into it is the unmistakable scallop shell, the emblem of the pilgrimage. Its grooves spread outward like sunbeams, a reminder of St. James's journey and of your own. Someone explains that the shell symbolized many things: baptism, resurrection, even the many roots of Europe, all leading to one point. But for you right now, it mostly symbolizes you still have far to walk. Quirky details: some towns along the Camino staged little plays or processions to honor St. James. Imagine walking into a village and finding half the townsfolk dressed as apostles parading through the streets, with papier-mâché angels wobbling above them. Religious theater was not just entertainment, it was instruction. For a pilgrim who could barely read, these spectacles brought the saint's story alive. At midday, you stop near a small shrine dedicated to James. Pilgrims kneel, touch the stone, murmur prayers. You kneel too, partly for reverence, partly because your knees need a break. Around you, the air feels thick with incense and hope. Some people whisper petitions for healing, others for forgiveness. You just quietly ask for slightly stronger sandals. Later that day, you overhear a heated conversation. One man insists that Santiago's shrine is holier than Rome. Another scoffs that nothing can replace St. Peter. Historians note that competition between holy sites was common. Each wanted to attract the faithful, the donations, the prestige. It's not unlike rival sports teams today, except instead of jerseys and chants, it was relics and reliquaries. As the sun lowers, you finally glimpse the spire of a larger church in the distance rising from a bustling town. Pilgrims quicken their steps, eager for shelter food, and perhaps a miracle. The town is alive with color merchants hawking badges shaped like shells, bakers waving warm loaves, children darting between the legs of tired travelers. This isn't just a road, it's an economy built on devotion. That evening after prayers and bread, you sit by a fire listening to a monk recite tales of the saint. His voice is slow, steady, meant to lull rather than thrill. He describes James appearing in visions, guiding armies, even riding into battle on a white horse to defend Christians against their foes. Whether myth or history, the story is powerful. Around you, pilgrims nod, some eyes shining, others just too tired to stay open. You realize that the cult of St. James is less about bones in a cathedral and more about the shared belief that this long, dusty walk has meaning. The shells, the shrines, the plays, even the politics, they all layer together like steps on the path. And as you drift towards sleep, the bells of the chapel ring again, soft and distant, a reminder that tomorrow you will rise and walk further into the saint's story. The road this morning bends through rolling hills, their slopes dotted with olive trees that look like old men hunched in prayer. You're not just walking through farmland anymore, you're approaching one of the lifelines of the Camino, the hostels and hospitals that promise shelter to the weary. Of course, promise is one thing and delivery is another. Your sandals scuff the stones as you come upon the first of these establishments, a squat building with thick walls and a door heavy enough to repel an army. Above it, a weathered carving of a cross and a seashell announces its purpose. Inside, it smells of smoke sweat and cabbage soup that has been reheated more times than you'd like to count. Still, to a pilgrim whose feet are two blistered disasters, it feels like walking into paradise. Hospitals in the medieval sense were not like the sterile wards you might imagine today. They were part hospice, part inn, part soup kitchen. Run by monks or nuns, they offered pallets of straw to sleep on, thin meals, and occasionally medical care that could be described charitably as experimental. Leeches, anyone. Some chroniclers describe surgeons trimming away dead flesh from pilgrim feet with knives that had probably seen too many uses. You eye your own toes nervously and decide prayer might be the safer option. Mainstream historical fact: the network of hospitals along the Camino grew especially during the 11th and 12th centuries, supported by kings, nobles, and religious orders who saw caring for pilgrims as both a holy duty and a source of prestige. Many of these hospitals later became full-fledged institutions, the precursors to modern healthcare in Spain. It's strange to think your aching souls are part of a legacy that shaped European medicine. But it isn't all solemn charity. Quirky detail: some hospitals had their reputations questioned. Pilgrims' tales grumble about watery soup fleas in the bedding, and staff who were more interested in donations than devotion. And of course, there were the smells. Imagine 100 pilgrims packed into a hall, snoring, coughing, and sharing the kind of air that would make even St. James wince. Cozy, yes. Pleasant, not exactly. You settle into one such hall for the evening. The straw crackles under you, softer than the bare earth, but not by much. Beside you, a Frenchman wraps his feet in rags soaked with vinegar, muttering that it keeps the blisters holy. Another man argues with a monk over whether the bread is truly blessed or just stale. It's a kind of theater of exhaustion where everyone plays their role: the pious, the complainer, the snorer. As night deepens, you hear a creak from the corner. A healer moves among the pallets, offering ointments that smell strongly of garlic. He dabs at wounds, checks fevers, and ties rough bandages. Historians still debate how effective these treatments were. Some argue they did little more than comfort, while others point to the survival of countless pilgrims as evidence something worked. Either way, the garlic smell lingers. The building itself tells stories. Thick stone walls keep out the cold winds. Tapestries hang with images of saints and scallop shells, and a great hearth blazes, its smoke curling lazily upward. Above the hearth, a wooden beam creaks as pilgrims hang their wet cloaks to dry. In the flickering firelight, you notice carvings etched into the walls, names, dates, perhaps graffiti left by travelers centuries before. It strikes you you're part of a chain that stretches back generations. Dinner is served late, a thin gruel with a chunk of onion floating like treasure. You eat gratefully, spooning with your shell. The lute player from yesterday tries to provide background music but is quickly shushed by 20 exhausted voices. Even saints need silence, apparently. After prayers, the hall grows quiet, except for the chorus of snores. You lie awake for a while, staring at the rafters, listening to the crackle of the fire. The word hospitality takes on a new depth here. It isn't luxury, it's survival. And though the bed is rough, the food plain, and the air thick with garlic and sweat, you feel strangely grateful. The Camino, you realize, isn't just the road outside, it's the network of stops like these that stitch the path together. Without them, pilgrims would falter. With them, even the most blistered feet can crawl onward. You turn onto your side, pulling your cloak tight, and drift off with the thought that tomorrow your sandals will carry you further west, one groan at a time. You wake to the sound of a bell, though it isn't the sweet kind that tolls from a distant church tower. No, this bell clangs right inside the hall, swung by a monk who clearly delights in making sleepy pilgrims lurch upright. You drag yourself out of straw bedding that clings to your cloak like porcupine quills, and shuffle toward the thin breakfast, a ladle of warm broth and a hunk of bread that could probably double as a building material. After breakfast, you're herded out onto the road again, and the Camino greets you with a new trial crossing rivers. Bridges, when they exist, are narrow and crooked, sometimes guarded by locals who claim a small toll is required. You cough up a coin, wondering if the saint really approves of such roadside shakedowns. Historians still argue whether tolls were sanctioned by local rulers, or simply invented by opportunistic bridge keepers who saw hungry pilgrims as walking wallets. Either way, you pay because the alternative is wading waist-deep through icy water while holding your shoes over your head. One bridge in particular makes your knees wobble. It's made of wood patched with rope and sways alarmingly as carts and pilgrims shuffle across. You grip the railing, whispering a prayer, while a donkey behind you decides it's the perfect moment to bray loudly in your ear. Somehow you make it across, but your heart races faster than it has since you left home. Rivers are not the only obstacles. The Camino winds into forest dense and shadowed where the trees lean close as if conspiring. It's here the whispers of danger grow louder. Bandits, always the bandits. They know pilgrims carry money for tolls or at least a loaf of bread worth stealing. You tighten your pouch stick closer to the crowd and keep your eyes on the road ahead. Quirky tidbits, some pilgrims wore disguises or carried fake pouches filled with pebbles, so if bandits struck, they'd hand over the decoy and dash away. Whether that ever worked is uncertain. You imagine the bandits weren't thrilled about being handed gravel, but it shows the creativity born of desperation. And yet danger isn't just from humans. Wolves roam the hills. Travelers tell stories of night watches where glowing eyes appeared just beyond the firelight. More often than not, wolves went after sheep, but pilgrims made tempting stragglers too. One German pilgrim insists loudly that if you sing psalms loudly enough, wolves won't approach. You decide you'd rather walk in silence and take your chances. Mainstream historical fact: medieval roads were rarely patrolled, and outside of fortified towns, travelers were largely on their own. Kings and lords might issue charters declaring safe passage, but on the ground the Camino was as risky as any other medieval highway. That's part of what made the pilgrimage so significant. Every step was both devotion and gamble. One evening, your group comes across a riverside clearing where a hermit lives in a hut built of stone and driftwood. He offers water from the river filtered through a hollow reed and tells stories of miraculous rescues, pilgrims saved from floods by St. James himself, or visions appearing on the water's surface. Historians still debate whether such hermits were holy men or simply eccentric loners making the best of life on the margins. Either way, the man's hospitality feels genuine, and you leave him a crumb of bread in thanks. As the sun sets, you trudge uphill toward a small village. The path is muddy, and your cloak catches on brambles. Yet there's comfort in the sound of fellow pilgrims, their voices rising in chant as if to ward off whatever lurks in the shadows. Children from the village run out to greet you, some begging for coins, Others simply curious about strangers from faraway lands. Their laughter reminds you the road isn't only hardship, it's also connection, a web tying places together that might otherwise never meet. You sleep that night in a stable, grateful for the roof, listening to the river outside. The world feels vast, dangerous, unpredictable, and yet somehow with each step you're carried along. Tomorrow there will be more bridges, more tolls, and probably more donkeys braying at inopportune moments. But for now, the straw is warm, the night is quiet, and your heart, despite everything, is steady. The next stretch of the Camino takes you into the heart of Castile, where the land rolls flat and the wind blows without pause. Walking here feels like being caught in a slow-moving oven sun above dust below, and a horizon that refuses to get any closer. Your cloak billows like a tired sail, and every few minutes you shake dust out of your sandals only to have more seep in. This is where hunger and thirst become constant companions. The inns and hospitals are fewer, and you start to notice how creative pilgrims get with whatever scraps of food they can find. Today's breakfast, a lump of cheese traded from a shepherd. By noon, you chew hard bread that could have been baked last winter. By evening, you're grateful for a handful of lentils boiled into something resembling soup. Mainstream historical fact, pilgrims often carried a wooden staff with a hollowed-out handle that doubled as a storage container for food or even wine. It wasn't just a walking stick, it was a medieval multi-tool. You eye your own staff and wish it came with a compartment for pastries. The quirks of Camino cuisine are endless. One French pilgrim insists garlic cures every ailment, so he eats it raw with bread until nobody wants to share a pallet near him at night. Another swears that onions ward off fevers, so he carries a string of them around his neck like medieval jewelry. You imagine the saints above looking down and muttering, "That's not quite how miracles work." You stop one afternoon at a small tavern, a rare luxury. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and the scent of roasting meat, except you quickly discover it's not beef or pork, but goat stew stretched thin with turnips. You eat anyway, savoring the warmth, and wash it down with wine so sour it puckers your lips. The tavern keeper calls it a fine vintage. You call it vinegar with ambitions. Food quirks aside, there's the matter of drink. Water from streams is risky, so pilgrims often rely on wine or beer, weak, watery versions, but safer than untreated water. Historians still argue whether medieval wine really kept disease at bay, or if it just dulled the misery of sore feet. Either way, you take another sip of vinegar wine and decide you prefer dull misery to intestinal disasters. Along the road, you notice how local farmers set up makeshift stalls, selling whatever they can spare: apples, shriveled from storage, salted fish, wrapped in cloth, even the occasional honeycomb. Children swarm pilgrims with figs, hoping for a coin in exchange. You trade a scallop shell for a handful of dried plums, marveling that such barter still works in this strange economy of faith and hunger. At camp that night, cooking turns communal. Pilgrims toss scraps together in a shared pot, stirring until the mixture becomes something edible, if not identifiable. One traveler contributes a pigeon he caught that afternoon, while another adds a questionable herb he swears will make the stew heavenly. You chew cautiously, waiting for your stomach to register an opinion. So far, so good. Quirky tidbit: some pilgrims carried blessing tokens, little slips of parchment with prayers written on them, which they dip into their soup for luck. Did it make the stew taste better? Not really, but it probably made them feel closer to their goal. As the fire crackles and the stew simmers, you hear stories swapped around the circle. One man recalls a feast back home with tables groaning under the weight of roasted boars. Another tells of famine years when bark and boiled nettles were the only food. You realize the Camino is a kind of equalizer. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone ends up gnawing the same stale bread under the same indifferent stars. Your belly isn't full, but it's enough to quiet the pangs. You curl up on your cloak, listening to the fire die down, the embers glowing like tiny guardians against the night. Tomorrow promises more dust, more garlic, more mystery meat. But somehow the simplicity of it comforts you. Life has narrowed to walking, eating, sleeping, and against all odds, laughing at the absurdities of it all. The morning light creeps over the horizon as you shoulder your pack and trudge onward, only to find the Camino testing not just your stomach, but your sense of direction. You're walking through rolling farmland when the road splits into three narrow paths, none of them marked. A group of pilgrims stands debating in loud Latin, which is a problem since you barely remember enough Latin to order wine, bad wine at that. This is one of the Camino's great frustrations. The maps are unreliable, the markers sometimes missing, and every fork in the road feels like a test of both faith and guesswork. You finally spot a small stone waymarker etched with a scallop shell pointing left, or maybe it's pointing right. You squint, tilt your head, and decide that if St. James wants you to go the wrong way, that's on him. Mainstream historical fact: pilgrims in the Middle Ages relied heavily on guidebooks like the Codex Calixtinus, a 12th century text that described routes, shrines, and even warned about dangerous locals. But not everyone had access to such a manuscript, so most simply followed crowds or asked villagers for directions. Of course, villagers sometimes gave deliberately confusing answers, either to keep strangers out or to steer them toward a tavern owned by their cousin. One quirky tidbit: pilgrims occasionally hired professional guides called saunterers from the French sentier, meaning Holy Land, who would lead groups through tricky stretches. Unfortunately, some saunterers were less holy guides and more opportunists, leading people in circles until they paid an extra fee. You imagine yourself stuck in a loop, realizing too late that you've been admiring the same crooked oak tree for 2 hours. The road isn't the only puzzle. Weather adds its own mischief. A sudden fog rolls in one afternoon, swallowing the landscape. You can barely see the person walking ahead of you. Pilgrims clump together, staffs tapping the ground like blind men feeling their way forward. Somewhere in the mist, a donkey brays mournfully, which does nothing to calm your nerves. Historians still argue whether pilgrims viewed such fog as a mere inconvenience or as an omen. Was it a test, a punishment, or just bad weather? Probably all three, depending on who you asked. Eventually, the mist lifts, revealing you've wandered slightly off course. Instead of the road, you're in a farmer's field, face to face with a very unimpressed cow. The cow stares at you as if to say, "Not another pilgrim trampling my pasture." You apologize, climb back over the low stone wall, and vow to pay closer attention. Yet for all the frustration, there's beauty in the uncertainty. You stumble onto hidden chapels, small shrines tucked into hillsides where candles flicker before painted icons. Once you find a well said to grant blessings to those who drink from it. The water tastes faintly of iron and mud, but you gulp it anyway, hoping for divine stamina. Your companion mutters that it tastes more like divine plumbing. Quirky pilgrim tradition: when travelers reached crossroads, some left small piles of stones, each representing a prayer. Over time, these became miniature cairns guiding later pilgrims. You add your own pebble, balancing it carefully on top of the stack, and step back to admire the little monument of collective hope. As the sun sets, the road narrows again, winding between fields golden with wheat. You realize that getting lost is part of the pilgrimage, not just geographically, but spiritually. You lose track of time, of place, even of your old self. What remains is the simple rhythm of walking, the trust that eventually the road, however winding, will lead you where you need to go. That night, you sleep under the stars, no hostel in sight. The sky stretches wide, freckled with constellations you can't name. You wonder if pilgrims centuries before lay in this same spot, just as lost, just as tired, and just as stubbornly determined to keep walking. You wake stiff and cold beneath the stars, dew clinging to your cloak, and for a moment you wonder why on earth you left your bed back home. Then you roll over, see the rising sun burnishing the horizon gold, and you remember you're chasing something bigger than comfort. Or at least that's what you keep telling yourself as you brush grass out of your hair. The Camino isn't only hardship, it has its wonders too. By midday, the road leads you to a monastery perched on a hill, its stone walls glowing pale in the sunlight. A bell tolls slowly, calling monks to prayer, and the sound echoes across the valley like a heartbeat. You climb the slope, sandals sliding on loose gravel, until you pass beneath an archway carved with angel saints and, curiously, a lion that looks suspiciously like a very confused dog. Inside the monastery is quiet cloisters arranged around a garden where herbs grow in neat squares. The smell of rosemary and sage cuts through the dust of your journey, and for the first time in days you feel truly clean even before washing. A monk greets you with a nod and offers a cup of watered wine. His words are few, but his eyes radiate a calm that feels like a balm. Mainstream historical fact: monasteries along the Camino weren't just spiritual sanctuaries. They were centers of learning, agriculture, and hospitality. They copied manuscripts, brewed beer, cultivated herbs for medicine, and kept the infrastructure of the pilgrimage alive. Many travelers would have faltered long before Santiago without these monastic oases. Quirky tidbit: some monasteries were known less for their holiness and more for their brewing. Pilgrims wrote gleefully of liquid bread that kept spirits high, sometimes higher than the monks intended. Imagine rows of tired travelers suddenly very cheerful after Vespers. You sip the watered wine you're given and wonder if you've missed the cheerful batch. The monastery chapel beckons next. You step inside and cool stone closes around you. Candles flicker against painted frescoes of saints with solemn eyes, their gazes steady and slightly judgmental, as if they know you were grumbling about soup just yesterday. You kneel, not entirely sure what to pray, and let the silence wrap around you like a cloak. Outside, the road is dust and noise, but here the stillness is almost overwhelming. The monks lead evening prayers, their voices weaving in a chant that rises and falls like a tide. You don't know the words, but you hum softly along, letting the rhythm carry you. Historians still argue whether these chants were meant purely for worship, or whether they also helped regulate communal breathing and calm, something like medieval ASMR. Whatever the intent, you find your shoulders loosening, your breath slowing, and your thoughts drifting somewhere between earth and heaven. After prayers, you join the monks and fellow pilgrims for a simple meal: lentils, bread, and a bit of goat cheese. Nobody speaks. The only sound is the scraping of spoons. A monk reads scripture aloud, his voice steady and measured, as though each word is meant to be chewed along with the lentils. You think briefly about making a joke comparing lentils to miracles, but wisely keep it to yourself. Night comes quickly within the thick stone walls. You bed down in a narrow dormitory, wooden pallets lined in rows. The snoring is just as bad as the hospitals, but somehow the sacred setting makes it easier to bear. Before you drift off, you catch sight of the stars through a high arched window. They gleam faintly, distant and steady, a reminder that even amid blisters and garlic breath pilgrims, there's still beauty to be found. As sleep overtakes you, you wonder what tomorrow will bring: more monasteries, more dust, perhaps another bridge that feels like a death trap. But tonight, in this quiet corner of the Camino, you let the chants echo in your ears, a lullaby from voices centuries old. You leave the monastery with the taste of lentils still clinging stubbornly to your tongue, and step back onto the road which today unrolls into the kingdom of Leon. The air feels thinner here, the horizon wider, the villages more scattered. You notice how the land shifts character: fewer olive trees, more scrub and hardy grass, the kind that clings to rocky soil, as if it too is on pilgrimage. But the most striking change isn't the scenery, it's the languages. On the road today, you hear a dizzying mix: Castilian, Galician, Latin muttered in prayers, French curses hurled at stubborn donkeys, even the occasional burst of German or English. It's like stepping into a medieval airport terminal, minus the security lines and overpriced sandwiches. Mainstream historical fact: the Camino de Santiago was Europe's first great cultural highway. Pilgrims came from every corner of Christendom, and in the process they carried not just prayers but songs, recipes, fashions, and even architectural ideas. Towns along the Camino blossomed into cosmopolitan hubs centuries before cosmopolitan was a word anyone threw around at dinner parties. You notice it firsthand at a crossroads tavern. A group of French pilgrims are sharing cheese while an Italian insists on slicing garlic into it because it's not food without garlic. Nearby, an English traveler tries to explain to a Spaniard the concept of meat pies, waving his hands like a magician conjuring something far more delicious than the tough bread currently on offer. You listen amused, realizing you're witnessing not just cultural exchange but culinary negotiation in real time. Quirky tidbit: some towns became famous for hosting multilingual services where priests would switch between Latin, French, and local dialects in a single sermon, hoping at least half the crowd caught the gist. You imagine the confusion: half the pilgrims nodding solemnly, the other half wondering if they just got accused of heresy. The Camino also brings art. Along the way, you pass small chapels decorated with frescoes that look faintly Romanesque, their saints sturdy and serious, painted with heavy outlines. Then, just a day later, you encounter carvings on a church doorway that feel almost Gothic: taller, leaner, more dramatic. Historians still debate how much the Camino accelerated these artistic shifts, but standing there in the dust, it feels like you're watching Europe's styles swap notes on a very long canvas. In the villages, markets bustle with pilgrims trading souvenirs. Shells from the coast of Galicia are sold hundreds of miles before you reach the sea. One merchant offers you a genuine relic in the form of a chicken feather, claiming it fell from a rooster miraculously resurrected by St. James himself. You raise an eyebrow. The feather looks suspiciously like the kind you brushed off your cloak this morning. Still, plenty of pilgrims buy them. It's good business, even if the miracle feels a bit paltry. At night, you gather with fellow travelers around a fire. A Breton sings a ballad, his words strange but his tune soothing. A German pilgrim produces a flute squeaking out a melody that might have been sacred, or might have been an attempt at entertainment gone horribly wrong. You laugh quietly because here on the Camino, music is music, and nobody minds if it's out of tune as long as it fills the night. As the fire dies down, someone tells a story about a Spanish knight who walked the Camino barefoot as penance for his sins. Another swears they met a woman from Norway who had been on the road for over a year carrying nothing but a wooden bowl and her faith. Historians still argue whether such tales were true or just pilgrim folklore, but to you, they sound perfectly believable. After all, haven't you seen enough oddities on this road to accept almost anything? You bed down on the hard earth once more, the chatter of different tongues still echoing in your ears. It strikes you the Camino isn't just Spain's road. It's Europe's road, a braided path where languages, foods, stories, and songs weave together like threads in a shared tapestry. And somewhere in that noisy, dusty fabric, you're a stitch too. By now, the days and miles have blurred together, a steady rhythm of sandals on dust and prayers murmured under your breath. And yet the Camino never runs out of surprises. Today's lesson, peculiar punishments and indulgences, because where faith walks, so does the occasional medieval loophole. The first clue comes in the form of a fellow pilgrim, a stout man from Navarre, with knees as creaky as an old church door. He boasts that he was sentenced to the Camino as penance for swindling a neighbor. At first you laugh, assuming he's joking, but no, his bishop literally ordered him to walk to Santiago instead of paying a fine or rotting in a cell. It's community service medieval edition. Mainstream historical fact courts and church officials often prescribed pilgrimage as punishment for crimes ranging from petty theft to more serious sins. The idea was that the hardship of the road would cleanse the soul. Whether it truly reformed anyone is up for debate, but it certainly filled the Camino with people who might not have chosen the journey on their own. Quirky tidbits, some wealthier penitents found ways around the blisters. They hired substitutes to walk the Camino for them. Imagine that, sending a poor farmer in your place while you relax at home, then claiming the spiritual brownie points. Historians still argue about how common this practice was, but the fact that records exist at all makes you shake your head. It's the kind of loophole that makes you wonder if medieval accountants had more power than bishops. You pass a roadside shrine where a priest dispenses indulgences, official slips of parchment, promising a reduction of time in purgatory for those who donate to the church. Pilgrims line up coins, clinking parchment fluttering in the wind. You mutter under your breath that the heavenly bureaucracy must be dizzy from all this paperwork. But still, you can't deny the comfort it brings those who clutch the parchment with trembling fingers, convinced salvation now fits in their satchel. Further along, you overhear stories of stranger punishments. One man claims a noble had to crawl a mile of the Camino on his knees to atone for blasphemy. Another swears that in a nearby town, a thief had to carry a heavy cross the entire route while barefoot. Historians still argue how much of this was true penance versus colorful storytelling, but you can't help picturing the poor thief trying to hobble across rocky paths with splinters in his feet. The mood shifts at the next village where a festival is underway. Pilgrims and locals mingle, music blaring from flutes and drums. Children chase each other in circles while women sell pastries stuffed with figs. You buy one, take a bite, and nearly burn your tongue. It's fresh from the oven. Sweet, sticky, absolutely heavenly. Who knew purgatory could taste like baked fruit? At the heart of the square, a preacher climbs onto a barrel, waving his arms and declaring that indulgences aren't enough. You must walk, bleed, pray, and suffer, or else St. James won't even open the door. Half the crowd groans, the other half cheers. You suspect even the saints would roll their eyes at such dramatics. As evening falls, you rest outside a small chapel, the stone walls glowing orange in the sunset. Pilgrims gather around to share tales of their own punishments and indulgences. One woman confesses she joined the Camino not for penance, But because her family bought her indulgences that felt too cheap, she worried her soul had been discounted. Another laughs that he tried to bribe his confessor with cheese, only to be told cheese is not valid currency for heaven. You stretch out under the fading light, realizing the Camino is as much about human weakness as divine strength. People stumble, cheat, buy shortcuts, or grumble at their punishments, and yet they keep walking. Maybe that's the true miracle, not spotless holiness, but the stubborn decision to put one foot in front of the other anyway. Morning dew clings to the grass as you shoulder your satchel once more, the smell of damp earth mixing with the faint odor of last night's fire. The Camino stretches onward, but now it offers a glimpse into more unusual side paths, routes that spiral through local superstitions, whispered omens, and tiny rituals that make you question whether pilgrims were guided more by faith or by folklore. The first sign is literal, a weathered stone carved with a crude spiral. An older pilgrim explains that walking the spiral clockwise ensures good weather. Counterclockwise invites storms. You nod politely, but notice he mutters a prayer to St. James just in case. Historians still argue whether these spirals predate Christianity, perhaps Celtic in origin, but to your tired eyes, it looks more like a doodle carved by someone very bored. Mainstream historical fact, many pilgrims did indeed incorporate local pre-Christian traditions into their journey. Shrines to Roman gods were sometimes rebranded as Christian holy wells. Sacred springs kept their reputation for healing long after the church had baptized them with saints' names. Pilgrims might stop to drink, to splash water on their faces, or to leave tokens like ribbons tied to trees. The Camino was as much an accumulation of folklore as of relics. Quirky tidbit: one superstition insisted that carrying an onion warded off illness along the road. Another suggested wearing your shoes backward for a mile would confuse the devil. You try to imagine walking with reversed shoes and instantly your arches ache in sympathy. Perhaps pilgrims simply used these tricks as an excuse to laugh at themselves during long stretches of dust. As you pass a farmhouse, a woman offers you bread, but only after she traces a sign over it 3 times with her finger. She whispers that this ensures no mischievous spirit follows the loaf into your stomach. You accept, gratefully deciding that if the bread comes with extra magical seasoning, you won't complain. Further down the path, pilgrims debate whether seeing a black dog crossing the road is a warning to turn back. One insists it means death, another shrugs and says it's just a dog. Historians still argue how much these omens truly influenced behavior, but it's clear the Camino carried as many fears as hopes. You chuckle softly, thinking how little has changed. Modern travelers still check their horoscope before boarding a plane. By midday, the group comes upon a grove of oak trees, where strips of cloth flutter from the branches. Pilgrims pause to tie their own bits of torn tunics, ribbons, or scraps of blanket, each one representing a wish or a prayer. The sound of the cloth rustling in the breeze is strangely soothing, as though the trees themselves are whispering blessings. You tie a small thread from your satchel, half amused, half serious. Evening draws near, and with it another layer of ritual. At the inn that night, a host warns everyone to place their boots facing the door, never toward the bed. Otherwise, he says, wandering spirits might slip into the souls and steal your strength while you sleep. You laugh nervously, but turn your boots around anyway. After all, better safe than sorry. As you settle onto your straw mat, the room filled with the sound of pilgrims snoring in strange syncopation, you realize that superstition isn't so different from prayer. Both are small gestures against the vast uncertainty of the road. Whether it's an onion in the pocket or a whispered Ave Maria, the point is to keep moving with a little less fear. And on a journey as endless as the Camino, sometimes belief itself, no matter how peculiar, is what carries you forward. By now you can feel the pull of Santiago in the air. The road has become busier, the inns more crowded, and the faces more expectant. Yet before the grand finale, the Camino offers one last stretch of hills and rivers, where pilgrims share not just bread and blisters, but the odd sense that their stories are weaving together into something larger than themselves. As you walk, a young monk tells you that when you finally reach the cathedral, you may witness the Botafumeiro, a massive silver incense burner swung across the nave like a pendulum on steroids. He explains it helps cleanse both the church and the smell of hundreds of unwashed pilgrims. Historians still argue whether its primary purpose was spiritual or just practical ventilation, but you quietly suspect it was both. After all, nothing says welcome weary travelers like hiding the collective odor under a cloud of frankincense. Mainstream historical fact, the Botafumero is indeed one of the largest incense burners in the world, weighing over 50 kilograms and requiring several men to pull it into motion. When it arcs above the congregation, it's said to swing nearly to the ceiling. You imagine lying flat on the floor just in case the ropes give way, because there's nothing soothing about being flattened by an airborne thurible. Quirky tidbit, some pilgrims claim the Botafumero has swung so wildly in the past that it once smashed against the walls of the cathedral. Whether that's fact or exaggeration remains debated, but the idea makes you picture medieval engineers nervously checking their knots. As evening draws near you and your companions enter a village buzzing with anticipation, vendors sell scallop shells, not the rough ones from the coast, but polished, painted versions meant as souvenirs. You chuckle, realizing tourist shops are nothing new. Pilgrims have always wanted proof they made it. You wonder how many shells ended up forgotten in trunks, only to confuse future archaeologists. The inn that night feels different. The chatter is lighter, the fatigue gentler. People share final stories. One pilgrim swears he saw a vision of St. James on the road. Another admits he mostly came for the wine, while a third insists the blisters themselves are proof of holiness. You sit quietly, realizing that whether or not the relic in Santiago holds true bones of an apostle, the journey itself has become the relic worn into your body, etched into your mind. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims understood relics literally or symbolically, but as you drift towards sleep, it seems the distinction hardly matters. The Camino has already done its work. The road has turned punishment into penance, strangers into companions, superstition into comfort. Tomorrow, the cathedral. But tonight you rest with the strange peace that comes from almost being done, from knowing that the final steps are within reach, and from the quiet certainty that however odd or ordinary your journey has been, it belongs to a tradition centuries old and endlessly human. The final morning arrives with a chill, though your heart feels warm enough to carry you the last miles. The path narrows, the hills flatten, and suddenly the towers of Santiago appear on the horizon like stone fingers reaching for the sky. You almost laugh at the sight. After weeks of trudging, sweating, and occasionally questioning your sanity, the destination is finally real. Pilgrims around you quicken their pace. Some begin to sing psalms, others clutch their staffs with white-knuckled hands. One woman even kneels to kiss the dirt, whispering thanks before she rises again. You just keep walking, savoring each step, as though your boots have absorbed centuries of stories and now carry you by their own will. Mainstream historical fact, when pilgrims reach Santiago, tradition dictated that they visit the tomb of St. James beneath the cathedral, often crawling on their knees for the last few meters. They would then hug a statue of the apostle, a gesture meant to seal their journey. The polished stone shoulders of that statue still gleam from countless embraces. Quirky tidbit, some pilgrims carried their seashells straight to the cathedral font, dipping them into holy water and then sipping it like a medieval shot glass. You watch one man do exactly that and nearly choke on laughter, imagining him explaining to friends back home that he drank divinity from a mollusk. As you step into the vast square before the cathedral, a hush falls. The building rises like a fortress of faith, its carved facade crawling with saints and angels, all frozen in stone, yet somehow alive with movement. You crane your neck upward until you nearly topple backward. The bells toll, reverberating through your chest like the heartbeat of heaven itself. Inside, the air is thick with incense and whispers. Pilgrims shuffle forward, eyes wide, voices hushed. The marble floor gleams, polished by thousands of weary feet. At the altar, the Botafumero waits, enormous and oddly elegant. Soon it will swing, scattering smoke like a silver comet across the nave. You breathe in the scent, sharp but strangely calming, as though even your tired lungs are being blessed. Historians still argue whether the relic truly belongs to the Apostle James or to some less famous bones, perhaps a Roman noble or a local martyr. But as you kneel, forehead brushing cool stone, you realize it doesn't matter. The relic is a focus, a spark. The true power lies in the thousands of miles walked, the friendships forged, the onions carried in satchels, the songs sung under the stars. You rise and embrace the statue of St. James, your arms around cold granite shoulders. and in that moment you feel oddly comforted. The saint doesn't hug back, of course, but centuries of pilgrims before you seem to lean in, pressing their warmth into the stone. You whisper a thank you, though you're not entirely sure whether you're thanking the saint, the road, or your own stubborn feet. At last you step back into the square. Sunlight floods the space, and a soft wind rustles your scallop shell, the symbol of a journey both completed and never ending. Because the Camino doesn't truly end here, it lives on in every story you'll tell, every blister you'll show off, every quiet night when you remember the sound of bells and the sight of seashells fluttering from your staff. And as evening falls, the cathedral glowing gold in the fading light, you find a corner of the square, stretch out your weary legs, and let your eyes drift closed. The road has ended, but the dream carries on. And now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let the story of the Camino fade into something softer, slower, and gentler. Imagine yourself lying at the edge of that great square in Santiago, the cathedral towers rising like guardians above you, the sound of bells melting into the air until they are nothing more than a faint hum. Your feet, sore from so many miles, finally rest. The blisters, the dust, the endless chatter of other pilgrims, all of it drifts away, leaving only the quiet comfort of completion. You've walked far, and now you no longer need to move at all. Just breathe slowly, evenly, letting each breath feel like another step towards stillness. Above you, the night sky spreads vast and calm. A few stars glimmer faintly, as though even they are ready to sleep. The cool air brushes your face like the whisper of a lullaby. Somewhere in the distance, incense still lingers, its fragrance delicate, not heavy, just enough to remind you that the sacred and the ordinary are always close together. You might think of the seashell, that simple, curved token of the Camino. Smooth, unassuming, yet full of meaning. Let it become your anchor tonight. In your mind's eye, place it gently on the bedside table, knowing it will be there when you wake, patient and silent, like all good symbols of peace. And so you rest. The Camino is finished, the story is told, and there is nothing more you need to do. The road is quiet now. The cathedral is quiet. Even your thoughts are quiet. All that remains is the softness of sleep carrying you onward step by step into dreams.